All right. Hello, everyone. Nick's adding everyone in here. See some new faces and some familiar ones. Some individuals who filled out the survey. So this is going to be a good one. This is pretty close to the holiday. So we had some people that are like, send me the replay, send me any guide you create with it. So this should be a good one. Just taking a second to look through here. All right, looks like we got a good group. I'm going to dig right in. I'm going to start by just giving a intro to the webinar and the structure. Then I'll introduce ourselves, and we're going to hop right into the juicy parts of the survey, which is why a lot of you are here. What we're trying to do today is just give some valuable information on the cost between different marketing projects you might be doing in 2023. Really for Maine, and I've said this around the office a couple of times. This will apply to some other cities across the East Coast, similar size to where we are here in Portland, because I know we have some people outside of Maine on the webinar. But Dustin and Nick are just going to come in with some considerations you should think for each type of project after we look at the results of the survey. And then we kind of want a little bit of participation from everyone here. Give us your thoughts, give us your experiences. So participation is going to be a big part of this. So don't be shy. I hit the wrong one there. Sorry about that. So just while people are still filtering in, tell you a little bit about who we are, a little bit about our culture. So this is a belief statement that we wrote as a team. I'm gonna read it. And it's that we believe to create great branding, you need to develop great relationships. And that's why we've worked hard to become the most trusted creative agency in Maine. Our creative gets results because we take the time to know your brand and we never shy away from the truth. So this is a belief statement we wrote as a team. And we're a full service branding and advertising agency. And our culture really revolves around trust. We like to be the trusted partner, not just for the creative that's going to push your brand forward, but also on the account management side, that you can trust us to be great account managers as well. So that's a little bit of insight into our culture. The services we provide is branding, website development, video production, and larger advertising campaigns. And we're working on a lot of really fun stuff. And Dustin, we have some projects lined up, some really fun ones for 2023.
We certainly do.
Some of them with some of you folks on this webinar. So thank you all so much. All right, Nick, let's jump into some of the juicy stuff here. Talk a little bit first about the survey at a high level. And we decided what we're going to do is we're going to we're breaking the survey down into, we're going to go over each project type. And the first is video, then we're going to do websites and branding. And just a note I had, this survey is really for discussion purposes. It's a little bit of an icebreaker before the conversation that's going to follow. We had 40 individuals take the survey. In the industries, we had higher ed, we had well-known brewery, we had a couple of manufacturers, we even had some agency owners, marketing freelancers, a couple folks in AEC, we had nonprofits, insurance, medical, hospitality, and professional services as well. So I know everyone's kind of going through and digesting here for video. I'm just going to quickly use this one to go through the different types of participants. Nonprofit, this was a mix of communications folks at nonprofits as well as leaders within nonprofits. Business, this is people with adjacent leadership roles to marketing. So this is not necessarily a marketing director. This is not a CMO, but this might be a COO, a CFO, or a manager of the business. And CP, that is communications professional. So we had marketing directors, but by the responses we got, I thought communications professional was a little bit of a better title. That's a mix of in-house marketing folks, freelancers as well, some marketing directors thrown in there, and then CMOs. These are senior professionals working at some of the larger agencies. They've been marketing directors in the past, and they've worked their way up. So just to kind of quickly go through this particular slide on the expected cost for video. In the survey, the average for nonprofits was $5,250. On the spread here on the lower end was $2,000, and on the higher end was $10,000 with what participants put in there. For businesses, the average was $11,000, and that spread was much larger. It was on the lower end. The lowest input we got was $2,000, and the largest was $50,000. And then on communications professional, we're right around the $6,000 mark. Our lowest was $3,000. Our highest was $10,000. CMOs were right around $15,000. On the low end was $3,000, and the higher end was $30,000. So we're going to open it up to hear your thoughts. But Nick, I know you're dying to jump in here, and I know you had a lot of notes on this. So what were your thoughts when you saw this part of the survey?
Absolutely. And just to preface this, I'm the creative director here at Anania Bailey, but I've been running a production company for about 12 years prior to coming to AB. And so video production has been a big part of what I do. And all these estimates look very low. Some very low and some just a little bit low. And I think that's probably because video is so omnipresent that it really creates the illusion that video is easy to produce, simple to produce. We see a lot of people have cameras in their pockets, right? Cameras on phones. So the assumption is that if my son or grandson is able to do TikTok, this shouldn't cost that much. And the fact of the matter is that video production is easily one of the most complex products to make, and it's really unforgiving compared to a lot of the other branding tools that you use. Really hard to fix video in post. A lot of people like to say fix it in post. That's really hard to do with video. If you don't get the right people on camera, you don't capture the right stuff. It's very high stakes. I want to talk about two different kinds of video that we're probably dealing with here, at least with the audience that's on and the audience that answered the survey questions. You've got kind of docu-style brand videos. They generally require fewer crew, but it definitely requires more time in the field, more time with interviewees, because you're trying to get really genuine, non-rehearsed responses from folks. So docu-style, you see a lot with nonprofits. You see it a lot with recruitment videos, trying to talk about, it's when you're trying to get people in the fields, frankly, right? You're trying to really get some heart. That's when we see a lot of branded docu-style pieces. And then you've got scripted pieces. This is more in line with this kind of standard commercial stuff that you might see. And, scripted requires a lot of crew. You're dealing with sound and lighting and staging. Shoot times might be a little lower because you've done a lot of pre-production in the lead up to know exactly what you're trying to capture. But you're also dealing with a lot of post-production with effects, sequences, graphics, etc. It always is a lot of time here. I say all that to say this, that all of that adds up really quickly. You're dealing with a lot of different staff, a lot of different crew, and you're dealing with very expensive pieces. To give you a sense on costs here, pre-production costs can be managed. Organizations can manage a lot of pre-production on their own. It's best to collaborate when you hire somebody to do that. But if you have an all client team, so to speak, you have your entire team managing pre-production, you don't really hire a team, a freelancer to do a lot of the pre-production, you're going to end up with a lot of hiccups. So most video that you're going to be buying pre-production as part of that whole piece. Otherwise, you end up with booking the wrong locations, acoustic problems, stuff that non-video professionals probably would overlook, can really hamstring your video. So any of the video costs that we're seeing here should include pre-production. And then you're dealing with videographers who are typically $500 to $1,000 a day. Shortest brand videos that you do typically require 2 days of shooting. So that's $2,000 kind of right off the bat. Then video gear rental is also very common, even when you hire a shooter. Typically, they'll also charge you for gear rental, which can be another $200 to $600 a day. Editors, similarly, between $500 and $1,000 a day. And you should expect video editors require around 7 days because they're doing your rough, your fine, and your final editing for an average 1 to 2 minute video. So that adds up pretty quick. And then there's a lot of other costs that I don't think people here that are looking at it are thinking about. If you're renting a space, if you have actors, particularly when you're dealing with commercial stuff, dedicated sound or lighting techs are between $300 and $500 a day. You're also going to have to do music licensing. You're going to have to get stock footage for anything that you don't have the ability to shoot or the time. We're dealing with on-screen graphics. You're exporting to multiple platforms. All this stuff really adds up very quickly. So if we're doing a base level when we're looking at average video cost, the average video is probably going to cost you between 15,000 and 50,000. And it can go much higher than that. We can talk about that later, but I would say if we're looking at a 2-minute branded piece, 15K is closer to the floor that you should expect. And Peter will show you a slide later on where we talk about how to expect kind of different products from different types of agencies, large agencies, smaller agencies, freelancers. And we'll talk a little bit more about how video costs might change and expectations need to change. But overall, I think that if you're paying $5,000 for a 2-minute piece, you're probably, if you're expecting $5,000 for a 2-minute branded piece, it's probably not something that's going to be evergreen, probably not something that'll last very long. And probably not very high quality, or at least not with somebody who's experienced doing all of these things. And rarely you want one person to do all of that. So yeah,
Nick,
that would be my expectation about it. Dustin? Yeah.
Just real quick, Nick, and Nick's pointed out, we actually have a slide that's going to go into what we see in the market when we respond to RFPs, and when we're bidding on projects. Our last slide is going to break down what to expect if you're working with a freelancer, a small agency, and a large agency here in Maine. So thanks for bringing that up. And Nick is, very qualified to talk about video. He shot for National Geographic. He's flown all over the world to shoot video, even worked with the Dalai Lama. So we're glad to have him on this webinar. But Dustin, what were your thoughts when you saw the results of this survey?
Well, I can't name drop the Dalai Lama, so unfortunately, I don't have that same level of experience in video. But I agree with Nick that it is low. Particularly when you're looking at certain styles of it, and I agree with Nick where I think what people's perception is that so much of it has been devalued by the easy access to mobile video and being able to capture things more easily than it ever has been before. But there's always a huge difference. You can always tell when you're getting something off of a mobile device, or if you have the proper process involved for doing commercial video production. So I think that, there's sort of a disconnect between what the local market expects and the kind of experiences that they probably had with video production in the past. So I think there's a huge disconnect there. One thing that I think is kind of surprising is that, when we're considering it, there's a huge value to video, both the short term and long term. One of the few things that I always find with video is that it's impactful storytelling. You can attach it to a bunch of different things. It can be used in a variety of media, and it can be attached so 1-to-1 to measure goals, to measure results. It's something that can really have an impact and be able to provide a result. So I think the challenge always comes up whether how much is invested towards that goal that it's trying to achieve. So I take a look at some of these numbers and I see, I see people saying we got to get by with getting this piece out for X amount of dollars versus this is the result we need to have, and this is how much we're willing to invest in getting this result. So that's kind of where I agree with Nick, and I see those kind of disconnects between what people are kind of answering, the difference between these different professionals that are answering it, and probably the level of experience they've had in whether they've been a part of the production process, the pre-production process, if they've done it in-house, if they've worked with an agency, if they've worked very intimately with their own videographer or freelancer to be able to get a project done. And then, when I really think about the next step is that kind of that usage and style, right? We're talking about a more corporate piece. We're talking about around that 2-minute mark. I think there is a huge piece here about, like I said, people being a part of that process, whether they're feeling the like the weight of in the time commitment that it is to required of that of an agency or even of a videographer. And that there's probably not a lot of thought put into like what kind of style of the video, like whether it's that docu style and all the different pieces that have to go to it, or a scripted one and all the different pieces that have to go into that, thinking about what questions we need to ask, what scripts we need to have, what storyboarding we need to do.
Yeah.
You're going to find that with these smaller prices, right? They're skipping those steps. They're completely leapfrogging over them. So, that will affect the impact and the quality of that video, the longevity of it, as Nick put it. Like, I completely agree. And, one of the things that I think about, when we see results like this, it's very clear that we're thinking about what kind of material that are going to be in these. Like, nobody's thinking we're going to be using trademark, AC/DC in anything that's going to be produced and used for, whatever piece they're going to be providing, because it's not really thinking about those extra costs that will eventually add up. So like, when I'm thinking about 2-minute video, I agree. Like the floor is really at that 15K. And then I think everything goes above and beyond that. So like 35 to 50 to well beyond it is thinking about all the different things that have to be in place, the many shots that you're going to need, the locations you're going to be at. And, in the moment we start talking about animation, that number goes way up, because then you're really going beyond just videography. You're talking about animation. You're talking about designers. You're talking about two different skill sets that are going to have to come together. And that means it's going to cost more.
Great. And I know Will's a photographer. I'd love to hear from him what he thinks of these prices. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and tell us their thoughts. I'd also love to hear from Mike from Coastal Forest Products, see what he thinks. So if anyone has any thoughts on if they were surprised by these results or if this is exactly what they expected, feel free to jump right on.
This is Will here. I think talking about the pre-production and post-production is very important, especially even for still photography. If you're just doing headshots or events, there's a lot of stuff that happens before and after, rather than just pushing the button. For stills, especially if you want retouching events, there's editing and culling and polishing the images so they're presentable and ready for you. So making sure you're at least discussing that with a photographer and making sure you're understanding timelines as well, because that time is before and after, making sure you're not cutting yourself too short.
We almost made this list a lot longer, Will, to add photography to it, but we're like, we got to try to keep it to a couple of things. But we agree that it's in the same line though of like the costs and the perception of the product itself is very different.
Yeah, thanks for that, Will. I follow you on Instagram, by the way, Will. I think you putting some pretty cool stuff out there.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Been following you for a while.
Thank you.
But you make a good point, about, the pre-production post is huge, even just if you wanted to spend $3,000 on color correction for a 2-minute piece, you could do it and you would still think you're getting a bargain, right? If that's something you really wanted to emphasize, like it's quite a bit. And yeah, just like with photography, we're talking about something that people see enough of that that I think the values have gone down around it a lot. It looks like somebody's talking and is muted here, by the way. I don't want to be on top of them, but
anyway. Who's that?
Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, but yeah, no, it's really interesting, and we've got more to say about video once we get to talking about kind of freelance video versus agency video, which I'm looking forward to doing more of. But I don't want to belabor the point too much right now.
All right. Well, we are working up to branding, but the next one we wanted to discuss was websites, and just to go through the data a little bit. The average for nonprofits was right around 16,000. The lower end was 4,000. Higher end was 40,000. Business, it was right around 27,000. Much bigger spread here. Again, 3,000 on the lower end, all the way up to 150,000. The communications professional average was right around 14,000. Lower end was 4,500, and the higher end was 25,000. And the CMO, the lower average was right around 70,000. The lower end was 15,000, all the way up to $200,000 expected to pay for a website. So much more of a range here than we see with video. And websites are equally as complex as video. So Nick, what thoughts did you have, or considerations did you have here?
I mean, unlike with the video where, it was a little bit of like, shame everybody, shame, don't you see the value here? I think that the website averages, I mean, the spread makes sense to me. I don't think that any of these averages are wrong. I think it's really mostly about kind of expectations and complexity, right? Websites range a lot from kind of being very basic, maybe a homepage, 5 or 6 pages, more is almost like a digital business card to sort of legitimize your organization and your storefront. But other user requirements can get really big. If you've got login portals, if you've got complex forms that need to be filled out for applications, or e-commerce features, which can get very complex very quick, all of that really changes both the front and the back end work here. So, I think that depending on the product, we can easily jump from 14,000 to 70,000. Just in the initial ideation and estimate. E-commerce, like I said, it's particularly more expensive to build and maintain. So the CMO range compared with nonprofits really makes a lot of sense, because there aren't a lot of nonprofits that are, selling swag, right? Or trying to do like customizable, couch deliveries, right? That all gets a lot more complex when you're talking about kind of larger organizations. There also are a lot of subpar websites, to be honest, particularly when we're talking about startups. And I don't mean to shame anybody here, but there's a lot of nonprofit websites that are really problematic that just, I think, are doubly hard to deal with, because one, that kind of skews expectations a little bit. You've seen maybe some bad websites, maybe you have one of those bad nonprofit websites, and so your expectations are a little low. But the challenge there too is that, particularly when you're talking about nonprofits, you don't want people to feel like it's a Ponzi scheme, and bad websites really hamstring and undermine the legitimacy of a lot of what these organizations do. I say your website is your storefront. It's kind of like your headquarters. And in that same way, websites are a lot like buying a building or trying to maintain one. Most of what you're paying for is not stuff you're going to see. So you're paying for electricity that's not going to burn your house down, or plumbing that won't flood your basement. That's a lot of what you're doing when you're paying for a website. So even if you're working with common platforms, I think a lot of us have heard about WordPress on this call. You're still paying for an experienced team to do custom coding that isn't kind of a tangled of web plugins and temporary solutions to stuff. You need your site to be able to survive changes to services and really avoid any website breaking updates that come from third parties. And those come a lot. Third parties do not communicate well with one another. And we've all been on websites more than once where we're going, this doesn't seem to be, are they not in business anymore? What does this mean? So, delays in services or breaks down in services can be really problematic for you. But the other thing is that, you're paying so that you have elements that are easy for your own team to update. You don't want to have to go to an IT person and have them update your blog for you, right? Or like post a new thing or make a correction to your copy. You're paying to have somebody go in there to allow your team to go in and make minor updates, but also build a secure enough website that you don't have to worry about somebody you don't know hacking into your website and changing things, or a well-meaning intern breaking your entire website because they clicked the wrong box, right? So like, these are all sort of like apocalyptic scenarios that we've all experienced or come close to experiencing. But the other thing that I want to emphasize here is a lot of what we're paying for too is mobile first and mobile friendly content. About 80% of traffic that's coming to your website is going to be doing it from phones and tablets, right? And so you're not really just paying for a website, you're basically paying for an app in many ways. The other thing I want to emphasize here that people might not be thinking about, but really adds value, and I would say easily bumps the value of websites up, is paying for SEO expertise. For those of you not inundated with this, SEO is search engine optimization. It just makes sure that your site is indexed, that it ranks well in searches against your competitors, against other people in verticals, that when people use search terms that are really common, you know, you're going to appear for the search terms. We recently did some work for a scholarship organization, right? And main scholarships are the most likely search terms that they're going to appear in, and we need to do the SEO work to make sure that they show up and rank well for those searches. That requires a lot of company and product specific research. There's a lot of kind of pre-production that sort of goes into that. And it really touches everything from the colors you put on your site to the font sizes, to the alt tags and hidden descriptions you have. SEO is really the foundation of making a functional website be effective, an effective marketing tool for you. And you're paying for that when you build a website. And if you're not paying for that, if you're not having a conversation about SEO with someone who's building your website, you got to stop and evaluate who you're talking to or how you're having this built, because it's really gonna hurt your website. The last thing I want to say here is accessibility for language, disability, even color blindness. This is something that is kind of a basic table stakes for us, but it's something that I think often isn't thought through on the client side, and not every organization is putting in the money to make sure that that's taken care of. But if you don't, one, it's kind of a crappy thing to do, like make sure your website works for people who are disabled. But the second thing is it hurts your searchability, and it hurts your website rankings as well, because Google tracks how accessible websites are. And if you're not accessible, you're not going to perform well. So these are all like kind of hidden costs associated with the website that explains why the base of a website is similar to the base of a video. So Dustin, am I missing anything? I know you've got some thoughts too.
No. And I think, when I look at this, I agree. Like the expectations are a lot more realistic. I think everyone has, at least everyone that contributed to this survey really knows that there's a certain value added to websites. Maybe it's that longevity that kind of like helps prop that up, and thinking about like, well, it's something people are going to use. It's daily. It's there all the time. People don't, and especially when they're thinking about this, right? They're thinking about a properly designed website. They're not thinking about like the kind of essentially the freemium kind of things you get from Squarespace, Wix, Shopify. They're thinking about something that's being worked on by a freelancer, by a small agency, by a large agency, to create a custom web experience that is going to essentially provide those results. So, I think everyone here is expecting something more along the lines, like you said, like WordPress or Magento, especially when we look at like CMOs and thinking about, the higher end is 200,000. They're definitely thinking about custom software. They're thinking about custom code. They're thinking about going well above and beyond on SEO. So I think there's a couple of different things here that really show that there is enough information around it. There's enough education around it. They may have been through a couple of experiences, or they've had websites built before and they weren't good, or they were, or they paid a certain amount and they kind of knew what they were going to get for, to kind of make this equal out to be something that people are going to expect when they're thinking about investing in their website, even in 2023. So one of the things that I think in particular is interesting when you look at nonprofit or the communications professional to the CMO is I really feel that part of that is like that part of its industry, part of its scope, right? So you're thinking when you're looking at some of these kind of numbers, it kind of equates, your CMOs are probably more thinking, like I said, custom software, probably e-commerce, lots of pages, lots of content around to it, a lot of products that have to be organized, inventory software, etc. I think that there's definitely a huge space between, fitting a need in a certain industry, which like automatically moves you up in the ranking of how expensive your website's going to be. So there's definitely a little bit of that at play from some of the answers that I see here. But I really like what you kind of put out there, Nick, about, thinking about like that invisible value, the things that you don't always see, that's really isn't surface. Some of the most expensive aspects of a website are those invisible things. Like, we're, like you said, we're talking about, search engine optimization. If there's not a big eye on that, if, content isn't being specifically created for it, if it's not optimized, it's going to be harmful. Performance is a big thing. Are you minifying code? Are you compressing images? Are you utilizing certain certain software, certain plugins, in WordPress to be able to make sure that that's happening on your site, and just some of the simpler things, information architecture. Are you really thinking about how it's structured, how people are getting around your website, how information is being provided on different pages on your website? And then all throughout the list of it, your plugins, your software, portals, user management, or, or really, we're in the era now, whether it's you're going with one of those smaller, Squarespace, Shopify that have a little bit more limitations to them, or going more free range with a Magento or WordPress website, really still making sure that you have that back end ease of use to be able to have people jump on there and be able to use it and use it correctly, without having to know, HTML, CSS, you have to really know all of your coding languages to just be able to produce something on your website. So I think when I look at these numbers, I see so many different aspects to it. And it's very clear that some people have an understanding of like what's involved in a website. Because when looking at it as from a whole, like kind of like as we were talking about all these different people that are involved in video production as a process, right? Websites are huge. They include so many different people, and so are so many different hats one has to wear. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about freelancers and small and large agencies later on. But, when you're thinking about that, a website alone is going to need to have, developers, which basically means you're going to have coders. You need copywriters to be able to make sure that there's written words on there. So that also means you need editors. You have designers. So you're having something designed and put onto a website, which means they're going to need a certain level of creative direction or creative directors. You have photographers, videographers. We've already talked about that part. There's a whole process to all of that and all the people involved in it. Then of course, we're talking about something that's lives out there in cyberspace. It's going to need IT specialists, and it's going to need project management, because it is a long process to get through an entire website, regardless of the scope of the site or the industry that you're in. So, it makes a lot of sense to think about how web design, essentially is a process. And there's definitely some input here that knows that this is a long process, a huge investment for our organization or business, and we know how many different components it's going to take to get the product we want.
Great. Nick, do you see anyone with their hand raised? I'm not sure if I can see that in my Zoom. I asked if anyone has any thoughts. Jump right on. I don't know if I see anyone's. I asked in chat for people to raise their hand. Some interesting thoughts in chat. Some people are surprised by nonprofits. Some aren't. Some seem to think it's a little low. And then one comment that, nonprofits, funding can be hard to come by. One thought I had there is, there's a big spectrum of nonprofits, some that are just volunteer boards, some that may have a handful of employees, some that have hundreds of employees, and some that are, some that might be well funded from an endowment. So nonprofits, it's certainly a big spectrum.
And there is a comment here, not surprised by the nonprofit thing, because getting funding for or justifying funding for anything that isn't a direct service is really difficult when you're in that nonprofit space. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think that's also why websites should be a bigger priority for nonprofits than they probably are. I think that it's antiquated to think that a website isn't a service or a direct service for the people you're dealing with. Even if you're hanging out with Jimmy Carter building houses, you still need to have a website that allows people to understand the services you provide, that provides them information about how they reach out and get in contact, that provides, a portal for somebody to apply for the services that you need. That gives them a clear understanding of what those services are, so you're not wasting your own team's time on somebody who maybe comes to you for services you don't provide, or giving them the information that they need in advance to help themselves and really self-service along the way. And that's all above and beyond kind of the specific services you can provide online. So it's the sort of thing that I think, I agree, but the funders are behind the curve on that thinking. That's absolutely right. They are. we'll do this presentation again. Bring all your funders. We'll talk to them about it.
I love that idea.
Yeah, because it is. I mean, it's problematic when people are that far behind the curve, but that's really far behind the curve. The internet has been a thing for a very, very, very long time at this point. And I think that if anything should wake up funders to how websites serve people directly. It should have been kind of during COVID when we saw everybody have to cling to this digital space. You know what I mean? A little bit like, Jack floating on that door at the end of Titanic. It was the last thing we all had, and it kept people up. It kept people afloat. It became a tool for service. So yeah, we just need to get people there. I agree.
I agree with all that, Nick. And just one thing is we've helped a lot of nonprofits with their websites, save them money with operations by automating processes that were manual. So, but it can be tougher for smaller nonprofits. For the last survey results, before we jump into what do we see in the marketplace, and I think it's going to address some of these questions that are going to come up, because we're going to talk about what if you go through a freelancer, what if you go through a smaller agency and a larger agency. But this is the results from branding. A nonprofit, the average was right around 7,000. The lower end was 2,000. Higher end was 15,000. Business, the average was 20,000. Lower end 3,000. Higher end 100,000. Communications professional, average was 13,000. The lower end was 5,000. Higher end was 45,000. And CMO, the average was 80,000. On the lower end was 7,500, and the higher end was 250,000. So Nick and Dustin.
And just one note on that too, because this is when the question is sort of out there, it was mostly talking about rebranding itself and not necessarily all of a rollout campaign fully attached to it, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It was assets such as the logo, the brand strategy, the visual style guide. So those deliverables, you're right, over a full rollout, which can be more significantly more expensive.
Yeah, and you're kind of spoiling what I was thinking about here a little bit, because rebrands are a bit like a tapas restaurant, right? There are a lot of add-on elements that you can have here. And I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing a big discrepancy in expectations and deliverables. The other thing, though, is that, rebrands can get very expensive based on the reputation of the agency you're working with. I would say this is probably one of those spaces where agency reputation can drive cost up in multitudes of 10 or 20 times more expensive than what you might get other places. And as we've seen with rebrands from Kia, I don't know if anybody owns or has driven behind a new Kia, but that logo leaves a little to be desired. I think there's a lot of new big brand rollouts that have been problematic, right? So I think that explains the discrepancy. I mean, there's essential elements of a rebrand that I think are absolutely included in this. I think logos, so we're talking about logo marks, word marks, seals, deciding what your front-facing fonts and new color palettes are. That's generally what people associate with a brand. Obviously, a brand is much larger than that. A brand is who you are, your reputation, how you sound. A brand is very big, and we don't need to get into all those things right now. But I think a couple of essential elements that are associated with a rebrand is all the brand discovery and industry research you're doing in advance. And yes, I mean that even for nonprofits, there's so much that goes into understanding either the people you're servicing or the people that you want as prospective customers, or ongoing client relationships, as well as understanding who's operating in that industry. So yeah, kind of all that discovery process is an essential element. And then brand voice and style guides. Again, that's just basic. Once an agency makes you, or a person, if you're going to go to an individual for a rebrand, but we can talk about all the reasons why that's a bad idea in a second. But once you have your logo and you've got your colors and you've got a sense of what your identity is, you want a guide so that you keep that well engaged, that you keep it healthy, that you use it properly, and that you don't, you don't create chaos from all your employees deciding that they're going to put brands on weird things or on weird colors or so on and so forth, right? So having that guide is really an essential part. But when you do a rebrand, there's also a ripple effect here that I think some people are assuming is part of a rebrand, right? Business cards, email signatures, just a polish on your website so that the logo that you have in your office reflects the logo that's in the top corner of your website, stuff like that. Signage, brochures, posters, packaging, and then obviously swag. Anytime somebody does a rebrand, they want to get, hoodies and keychains for their staff. So all that ripple effect stuff, that's also, I assume, included in what people are thinking through here. I would say there are probably best practice elements that maybe aren't being considered, except maybe down that big CMO budget. But, we are talking about a rebrand, launch, a package for that launch, a plan for that launch. But also awareness and transition campaigns are really important, especially if you're going in a drastic direction with your logo. If it's not drawing on some of the same visual elements or the same colors. If
Or
you're
you're
changing
renaming.
your name, that's
Yep.
huge. You probably want a 9 to 14 month plan for how to make sure that works for everybody. And then, a culture guide for your internal employees is a big part of it. I think that this is really important when you're dealing with B2C organizations and nonprofits, is having a clear sense of your culture. I think a good nonprofit probably has this. I think there's a lot of nonprofits that haven't had an opportunity to create that culture guide. And there's a lot of corporations that would really benefit from that culture guide. And then obviously, brand strategy for the C-suite. So you get a sense of how you can use this new brand as a tool to kind of meet your strategic goals and campaigns to build off that. All of that are really kind of best practices that don't come to mind first, but I think are included in a holistic kind of full rebrand. I will say that means that there's lots of expertise involved, lots of project management, lots of research. I'm not going to do this because it's very similar to kind of what the point that Dustin made about websites, but everything from creative direction to marketing expertise, graphic designers, copywriters, so many people are involved in this. Our rebrand really requires an army, both client side and otherwise. One thing that people maybe aren't thinking about is how often you need to do a brand refresh, maybe not a full rebrand, but definitely refresh of your brand. Brands get antiquated really quickly. Aesthetic styles move pretty fast. There aren't a lot of true classic brands, and most people will be rebranding every 5 years. You might see like huge organizations rebrand every 10 years, but we've seen probably 5 different Pepsi logos come through in the last, 15 Super Bowl years. It happens pretty quick. So even if you're not doing a full rebrand, brand refreshes happen a lot, and those are far more affordable, but they're still something that I would say is probably $5,000 at a minimum for a brand refresh. And the last thing I want to say here is it looks like nonprofits are prepared to pay largely for a new logo, business cards, some branded water bottles. I understand all the reasons why that might be the case. Whereas it looks like CMOs are talking about paying for a brand that aligns with their strategy for their organization over the long haul. You can cherry pick these deliverables, like I said, to try to still make strategy decisions with a rebrand that are good for the long haul without paying us $80,000. I say that as mercy to those nonprofits who are staring down the barrel of a rebrand and thinking, oh man, we need a lot more with a lot less. I think you can have some creative conversations to really pair exactly what you need for effective branding tools without having to get the whole kit and caboodle. So have faith, nonprofits out there. This can be done. You too can have a fancy brand. Dustin?
Really
Yeah.
quick. I mean, we've even had some nonprofits just say, can you just give us some help walking us through this process? Not just maybe they I'm thinking
Can we rent Nick for like a couple afternoons? Can he be a stakeholder in this decision? It's like-
Exactly.
Yeah, you guys do rent me out at an alarming pace, and I really prefer different nomenclature around it. That's just a favor.
We're working on it. We're working on it. But there's definitely a little bit of that. And one comment I wanted to make back when you were talking a little bit about all the different the audiences that this needs to get in front of, Nick, even in the nonprofit spaces. We're also thinking a lot about like recruitment, and we've talked a lot about employer branding this year, and I think that's a huge component to it too, where there's a certain level of understanding of it, or there's a complete disconnect of it, how it affects their recruitment their recruitment efforts throughout the year. So yeah, I mean, when I take a look at this, I mean, obviously there's a huge discrepancy. I mean, when you see, nonprofits all the way down to 7, and then you see CMOs looking at a rebrand and they're seeing it 10 times higher than that. I think that it really, part of it is some people have in their mind a certain idea of like your CMOs clearly have an idea that there's all the other rollout items are going to be added into this. Hours of research are going to be added into this. There's no stone left unturned, when you're looking at that CMO level rebrand. But you're also seeing that, there's probably something left to be desired or not, executed to the nth degree when you're taking a look at, the communications professional thinking it's only about 13, or nonprofits that only think it's about 7. When you have to think about this as an average, this is the middle of the road that we're actually getting from these. So I think that there's definitely a discrepancy there. One of the things I always like to say, and we always put it out there, right, is that a brand is much more than just a logo mark. I think especially when Nick's talking about brand refreshes, sometimes it's not just the color and aesthetic, but sometimes after a couple of years, you need to realign the goal, expand the goal, really restructure your brand narrative to go in the direction that your organization or business is going. And that alone is enough to really trigger off a rebrand in some form and how you execute and how you campaign it. So I think that there's definitely, mixed ideas on whether a rebrand is just that logo mark and you're getting a certain, deliverable for that, or whether, you're looking at something that's going to be a long-term successful investment over time. Because brands are, that they're a system, and then I think, CMOs are looking at it as a system, and you're looking at nonprofits, or you're looking at communications professional, they're seeing a single product at the end of a process. And that system alone, has so many pieces to it, and there's just a lot of different things that go into it from all aspects. As Nick kind of went through, design, writing, web development is probably a part of it. If you're going to be doing a full rebrand, you might be wanting to, have a reveal, and, then you're going to be talking about video, you're going to be talking about photos, there's a whole different thing to it. But I definitely think that there's a little bit of like misplacing value on like what might, like some aspects of it that might be kind of either thrown in or that are pro bono, or that were, some things, and I've seen it happen with a couple of different scenarios where, like a website project comes with a logo mark and they consider that branding, and it's not really branding. So I think that there's a lot of challenges when thinking about like, well, what does a rebrand really look like, and what are all the components to it? And I think that some people get it in this survey and some people really don't get it in this survey. But I think, when I really look at this, I think about that there's, especially the lower end, they're thinking too much of short-term wins. They're thinking about that this is a much smaller product, and it reminds me a lot of the old saying of like about service, right? You can have, good, fast, and cheap. So you can choose 2 of those and be able to have it done. So generally, when I think about this, I see, well, more than likely it's going to be speed. And whenever we're talking about rebrands, we're like, well, by the time you discover that you need a rebrand, you're probably like, we need the rebrand now. And that's a process that takes 90 days. So usually it's going by quick. So you have to be, thinking about, okay, can we make that investment, or, are we going to be doing this properly? And I think that you can kind of see, the kind of mindset behind some of these different answers when you're taking a look at this data. And you can really see, how many of them are really thinking about this as an investment that's really going to provide a long-term, win for this organization and create some foundations to do other things off of. And what, to some of these, like, well, we need it and it's essential and it needs to get done now, and this is what we're going to spend on it. Because I think the biggest challenge that we see, especially being a branding agency, is really understanding the value of branding and what that entails with it. And it's not just, it's not just a trendy action, as Nick kind of put, every 5 years, you need to be taking a look at your brand and really making that assessment. Is our brand strategy still relevant? Is it still on point? Are we matching that? how are we already looking antiquated? Is our messaging not living up to where we are now? And, but that was a good spot for us 5 years ago when we were doing XYZ. There's a lot of different challenges to that. And, and I think that it's, there's a challenge when looking at rebrands and thinking about all the different pieces to it and how much of an investment it needs to be made. And I really agree with Nick where, when you're talking about a rebrand, you're talking about it with all of these different component parts. It's a lot of expertise. It's a lot of project management. And, I think some communications professionals don't quite grasp, where, how big a rebrand really is. Because from the way that I see these kind of numbers here, I'm seeing people that might have been a part of the branding process, but maybe have never been stakeholders that have like sat down, had that kind of brand immersion, gone through research with an agency or with an agency, small or large, and really been every step of the way in a branding process. And all the way to rollout and execution and how to campaign it afterwards. Because I think that's even some of the experiences that we have right now of, we've worked with a couple of different brands that have had logo work, that have had renamings before, that have had a branding partner at one time, but then they're still really uncomfortable in that space after the brand has been made. How do we get it out there? How are we rolling this thing out? How are we communicating it? And I think that you can see a difference in the mindset between the different answers that we got here.
Great. And I think you brought up my point. I mean, my biggest surprise, and we are running up against the clock, was communications professionals. And I think that's exactly what you said. Maybe they haven't been through a full rebrand, so they don't know how much it goes into it. So here's our last juicy slide. This is what our thoughts are on how much these different project types are going to cost you by the different providers: freelancer, small agency, larger agency. This chart, take a screenshot if you want. If you're going to take a screenshot of a chart, I'd recommend this one. We had a heck of a time in Google Sheets getting this to be perfect. So there's a little wonkiness to it, but it's really the best way that we have to display this data. And this comes from, like I said earlier, this is our insights from responding to RFPs, from working with freelancers, from really just living and breathing this stuff and really being in the marketplace and seeing what is out there in Maine currently. So instead of going through this point by point, if anyone has any questions for this webinar, I'd recommend putting them in chat right now. And Dustin and Nick, I know you guys had a couple thoughts. We are running up against the clock here. So if you want to maybe take a couple key points, and if people want to fire away with questions in chat, maybe we can answer one or two of those.
Yeah, that sounds great. I can be brief. I don't do it a lot, but I can. I think general thoughts on rebrands: don't use a freelancer for your rebrand. No one has the complete set of skills to do that job right. Most of the time, and don't get me wrong, as somebody who is a jack of all trades, I acknowledge I'm a master of none. But if you have a master of none do your rebrand, your brand isn't going to be good at anything. So I'd avoid that. I'd also just say that when it comes to any kind of rebrands or branding thoughts, they're only as valuable as the energy you put into them too. You can't really buy your way into a good brand. You really need to engage. For video, costs for video can scale up a lot. I know somebody who just got paid $200,000 by an all-girls high school to produce a branded video. And that branded video is going to be 8 to 10 minutes long for $200,000. That's a lot. For reference, Smithsonian will pay $220,000 for a 90-minute video. So that's a lot of money, but people pay it. And part of the reason why people pay it, I will say this, not legitimizing you should pay $200,000 for a 10-minute video, but there's the ceiling on video can get really high. No concepts, no materials that you're making for branding, no marketing tools have the ability to go viral like a video does. Video really allows you to lean into the storytelling aspect of what you do, and there's a really high ceiling for that. We talked a lot about video cost. It was surprising to everybody. I would say if you're trying to get more value out of video, you should make an agreement so that you own all the raw footage that they shoot, so you can go back to that well for anything in the future, and make sure everything's shot in 4K. That way it's really easy to use it for a long period of time. 4K is going to remain relevant for probably the next 5 to 8 years. It's great. And then the last thing I was going to say about website, be really cautious when you're looking at a website designer, when you're looking at a freelance designer. Most people aren't going to realize they had a bad website designer until 18 months later when their website starts to break down. Some freelancers are fantastic. I know some fantastic freelancers, but they're not a company. They might disappear. They might move away. You might not get the support that you need ongoing for a website. So I would say never rebrand with a freelancer. They don't have enough skill sets. Video freelancers, limited skills, but if you're doing something small with a small audience, I understand why you might go that direction. And website freelancers, just really be cautious, ask a lot of questions, and talk to people who have had websites made by those people years ago to make sure that they still work and operate the way you want them to. I think those would be my key points. Oh, and the last one is like SEO, search engine optimizations. Critical, ask questions. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and I can briefly put mine in there too. So, and I look at these at all sort of the 3 different levels. So for freelancers, I agree with Nick. It's good to be able to have some freelancer experiences. It's good to have them in the back pocket for doing smaller projects. But these 3 are particularly very large projects. They are investments, not purchases. You should be considering that when you're working on them, and you should be thinking about all the many hats that this one person needs to wear. Are they able to wear them? How many freelancers do you really need to be able to make that? And does that actually make the same cost of a small agency? So kind of think about it in those terms. Small agencies, you're generally going to have, you need to still ask a lot of questions. You got to ask a lot about process. You need to ask about what, the industries that they've worked in and still have part of that experience. But generally you're going to have with smaller creative shops, with smaller agencies, being a part of Maine Ad Design, us and many of the other ones here in Maine, they have a variety of different skill sets and purposes and alignments. So it's good to really ask those questions to see if there's a good culture fit, but that's generally where you're going to find sort of the nice middle ground, the Goldilocks kind of effect. And larger agencies, of course, you're going to get, you are going to get, what is promised to you. I mean, you put in the investment, you're going to get it. It's always good to always ask questions of larger agencies. What team are you kind of getting? Usually at a large agency, you are starting to work with more than just one creative team, which means, are you being serviced by the team that you're showing in the portfolio? And you need to ask those kind of tough questions sometimes to make sure that you're getting, the quality product from the agency with that level of reputation as well. So you're not just getting a good name, but, and getting their B team, you want to be able to make sure that you are getting what you're paying for. And that's always the challenge when you're working with larger agencies. So that's my usual 3 blocks to each of these. And they kind of just apply to, whichever product you're really looking at.
Well, this was jam-packed, so we went a little late on this. Dustin and Nick, one question Stephanie just threw in there, which I think is important. What's the difference between it, like size-wise, small agency versus large agency? What's the cutoff?
I mean, I think that if the easiest one is if you're working with an agency that only works in one state, it's probably small. We've got some agencies here in Maine that would be considered larger agencies in Maine, but certainly wouldn't be considered large agencies outside of the state. So even though there's a lot of kind of diversity in some of the sizes of the agencies that you see operating in Maine, I would say most of them I would consider small. That said, some of them are going to charge you large agency bucks. Yeah. And some of that is because I think some people, they aspire to kind of be at that large agency level. There's a little bit of a fake it till you make it vibe. I will say that there are some agencies in Maine that service a lot of other places outside of Maine. And so just because it's a Maine agency doesn't mean it's a small agency, but if they're an agency that only works with clients within the state, I would say they're probably smaller. There's obviously some states where that's less relevant. I would say if you've got an agency in California, New York that only services New York and California clients, they very easily could be a large agency. But typically, if you're just statewide, you're not dealing with national level clients or national level work, I would keep that small. I don't know if I've got a particular number that I would associate that with though. Dustin, Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like when I kind of think of it, knowing the scale of how many like employees you have, I think when I would dictate like a small versus large agency experience, especially for our market, is like the size of the team. So like thinking about how many people are actually working on your particular project can kind of scale it for like, are you working with, the A or B team of a medium-sized agency, medium to large kind of goes from there. So like, that's kind of where I go to. A small agencies, you're generally going to be working with like the set of people that make up that entire
Yes,
agency.
that's a good point.
Yeah.
No, that's a good way to describe it. I mean,
Yeah.
and again, this is the kind of thing, feel it out when you're talking to that agency to try to get a sense for it, because you don't want to be an agency working with the agency's B team typically. It's not that they're not talented, it's typically a lack of experience that you're dealing with, or an over reliance on one single art director. That's normally what you run into when you're on the agency's B team. And when you're dealing with their A team, that's fantastic, provided that that it's not a case where they only have one team and you're their 50th client and they haven't expanded, or they're not dealing with enough resources. That's the kind of thing that you need to feel out. Honestly, it's a little bit like dating. I would say before you sign on to doing any of these, like Dustin says, these are investments, they're not purchases. Get to know them, meet people in person, go out to lunch, have these discussions, because not only do you want to get a good sense of who you're dealing with, how big they are, whether they're the right size, the right match, but you're going to be collaborating. All of these are very collaborative projects we're talking about. And that really means that you need to be able to work well together, that you understand kind of what everybody's roles are, and that you're willing to be really intimate and honest. I think, it's part of our values that Peter read at the front end, but you need to have an intimate relationship with your creative agency when you're doing big stuff like this. They need to understand you. You need to be honest with yourself about what you can do, what you're trying to do, and how you communicate. Because, even if you're all on the same page, the wrong personalities can make it really hard. Changing personnel can make it really difficult. So yeah, I think my advice is big or small, like get to know each other a little bit before you decide to jump in on any of these big three things, because they're all very large projects.
Yeah, that's thanks for that, Nick. That's great. Thank you all for being here. Just a note, we're on our favorite platform for us as the agency is definitely Instagram. So follow us there. If you're not on Instagram, we're also on LinkedIn and Facebook. Dustin, he's our account executive. Here's his email. Any questions? If anyone's new on here, shoot him an email just to say hi. I do see a couple of new people on here, so we'd love to connect with you. Also, I mean, if you want to further this conversation, that Calendly link schedules a meeting with him, just a free consultation, just to talk shop or go into some of this a little bit more. So feel free.
Yeah.
And thanks for everyone for being on this. We know it's close to the holidays, and we actually have a lot of replays to send out, but we appreciate everyone showing up and being part of this.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Happy holidays.